Hello, I'm Bryan Williams, executive producer of In Their Own Words, the Tuskegee Airmen. It is my sincere desire that the legacy of the Airmen remain true testament of our rich history. Your monetary donation will greatly enhance the Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site Incorporated in their unwavering commitment to maintain the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank you very much, and God bless.
The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African Americans to fly combat missions in the United States military during World War II. Their accomplishments helped pave the way for desegregation of the military in 1948. On January 4th, 2021, the U.S. Mint released the final coin in its America the Beautiful quarter series in honor of the Tuskegee Airmen. The reverse design depicts a Tuskegee Airman pilot suiting up to join the fight during World War II with a molten field control tower in the background. The pilot looks upward with pride and confidence as two P-51 Mustangs pass overhead. The inscription, "They fought two wars," is arced across the top as a reference to the dual battles the Tuskegee Airmen fought, oppression abroad and racial discrimination at home. Today, we celebrate the Tuskegee Airmen yet again for their many contributions to the cause of civil and human rights.
Hello, and welcome to the second annual Tuskegee Airmen commemorative event. My name's Omar Neal, former mayor of Tuskegee and host of the You Got the Power show. Today, on this day, March the 7th, 2021, we celebrate, we commemorate the men and women of the Tuskegee Airmen. You see, it was the adversity, the discrimination, the subjugation that they had to go through, both at home and abroad, that catapulted them to being some of the greatest human beings ever to live. In fact, the theme is Tuskegee Airmen, victory at home and victory abroad. So join us, the Friends of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, Inc., as we celebrate, commemorate, and shed love on the men and women of the Tuskegee Airmen. Well, I can't tell you how excited I am to be a part of such an auspicious occasion. We're going to be talking later on with two Tuskegee Airmen, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart and Lieutenant Colonel George Hardy. But before we do that, I want to bring forth the chairman of the board of the Tuskegee Airmen Historical Site, Inc., Colonel Retired Palmer Sullins, to bring greetings and give you a little history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and as well as the origin of the Friends of the Tuskegee Airmen Historical Site, Inc.
Hello, I'm Colonel Palmer Sullins, Jr. We are here at Tuskegee, Alabama, Molten Field. This is Hangar 2. Hangar 2 is where the exhibits are dedicated to illustrating what the Tuskegee Airmen did when they were deployed. There's another hangar here, that's Hangar number 1. Hangar number 1 is dedicated to exhibits that show what the Tuskegee Airmen did when they were primary training out here at Molten Field. As chairman of the board with Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, it is my honor and privilege to once again remind everyone in Alabama that Tuskegee Airmen Day is March 7th of each year. This was the idea that our executive director, Dr. Gwendolyn Trawick Moore, came up with, along with our board member, Mr. Fred C. Crawford. Our organization, Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, is a 501c3 organization. This organization was actually put together and became a reality as a result of 3 Tuskegee Airmen coming together. They included Lieutenant Colonel Herbert E. Carter, who was a Red Tail and a Tuskegee Airman, Mr. Booker Conley, who was a member of the Civilian Pilot Training Program, and a Tuskegee Airman mechanic who was William Bill Childs. These individuals sent forth documentation which made the Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site a working organization in partnership with the National Park Service. Our mission is clear. It is to assist the National Park Service with its directive to preserve, commemorate, and protect the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. We provide support to them, the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site and the National Park Service, with agreed-upon projects, which include education programs, fundraising, memberships, donorships, corporate sponsorships, and volunteering. There's no doubt that the Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, Inc. organization is dedicated to the sustaining of the Tuskegee Airmen legacy for generations to come. With your help and your donations, you can help us make sure that our mission will be realized. Please donate. And I'm happy to announce that one of the projects, or several of the projects that we're planning in the very near future, include a Tuskegee Airmen Memorial Wall, which will be erected here at Moulton Field with all 15,000 plus names of those men and women who supported the pilots and Tuskegee Airmen, as well as the pilots. Also, a statue that's dedicated to the Chief Flight Instructor, Charles Alfred Anderson, who was very instrumental in getting the whole thing off the ground when he took then Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's another statue we plan to put up. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then the First Lady, went after flying with Chief, went back to her husband, the president, and convinced him that Tuskegee was the place to put the Army Airfield. The rest is history. Donate, 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 and we thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you for giving us that wonderful background in history. Oftentimes, we don't know the history of different organizations and how they interface with the Tuskegee Airmen. Now we know. Thank you for sharing that information with us. Now I want to go and I want to talk to my friends. I want to talk with 2 individuals that I've just met recently, but I feel like I've known 1,000 years. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming 2 Tuskegee Airmen, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart and Lieutenant Colonel George Hardy. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Omar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Man, let me say, you know, I'm in perpetual awe of the Tuskegee Airmen. I'm from Tuskegee, so I knew about you all growing up. Obviously, I was not born, but it was always this mystique of the Tuskegee Airmen that permeated our community. And I was always told that the essence of the Tuskegee Airmen was service and excellence. And so therefore, when you marry service and excellence, you get excellent service. And that's the essence of the Tuskegee Airmen. Am I right about that, gentlemen?
You are.
You sure are. Yeah.
Wow. I want to take you back for a moment, because I read something that really kind of disturbed me. And I want to know if you knew about this prior to joining the Tuskegee Airmen. group. It was a study that was done in 1925. It was the Air War College study of Black soldiers. And they concluded that the American Negro is inferior in mental capacity, lacks leadership, and cannot accept responsibility, being subject to panic, in a rank coward, is a rank coward, lacks intelligence and initiative. That's what they said about us. Did you know that? And if so, what gave you the audacity to pursue something like being a pilot? You know, I was always told that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And there were few pilots during the time that you, after Black pilots, during the time that you pursued being a pilot. I want to know what's the impetus of your becoming pilots. I want to start with you, Colonel Stewart, and then I'll go with you, Colonel Hardy.
Well, I found out that study that you just mentioned was done in 1925 by the War Department, and it was an evaluation of the worth and usefulness of the Black soldier at the time there. Of course, I was mighty concerned when I heard it for the first time, and I couldn't believe that this would be a study of the military department at the time. And of course, it was my feeling that I would like to go ahead and prove them as wrong as can be. And thankfully, as it turned out, the exploits of the Tuskegee Airmen did prove much to the contrary of what that study tried to purport.
Well, Colonel Hardy, did you know about the study, and what was your thinking?
Well, yes, I was aware of the study, but I didn't pay attention to it. Some of the fellows had graduated before me at Tuskegee and proven they could do a job, and I came along toward the tail end, and I was able to do the job. Ended up having a full military career. So I heard about the study, but I didn't pay any attention to it.
I'm glad you didn't pay any attention to it, gentlemen. I want to talk a little bit about this notion of racism. It was told to me that if you don't understand racism, then anything else you think you understand will only serve to confuse you. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you saw the issue of race, and did you believe that this whole Tuskegee Airmen experiment was just to prove that we were inferior, and you all put a monkey wrench in this hypothesis that we could not fly planes?
Well, I felt as though it was a challenge, and my greatest desire was to fly. I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to not just prove I could be a pilot, but it was a desire of mine ever since I was a young child, when I first saw airplanes flying through the air. But at the time, I felt as though I was a member of a organization that was out to a number of things that they were going to do, but one was to prove itself. And as I said before, is to prove that study that was made in 1925 was completely false, completely wrong. And the outcome was such today is what we can look back and see that study was proven to be absolutely wrong.
How aware of this notion of racism and systemic racism were you, Colonel Hardy, growing up and then coming into the Tuskegee Airmen experience?
Well, growing up, you knew about racism, whatnot. I grew up in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia had areas around the city, racially divided areas, Italian, Jewish, not Jewish so much, but Black and whatnot. So, in fact, I lived in a racially divided neighborhood, but I walked 1.5 blocks to the west and went to a all Afro-American elementary school. The teachers, the principal, everyone Afro-American. I went to junior high school, walked 2 blocks to the east and 1 to the north, predominantly white junior high school. Then the South Philadelphia High School, 281 people in my graduating class, only 4 Afro-Americans. So you see how the city was divided, whatnot. So learned to grow up in that. And, but then going to Tuskegee, it was really something, leaving the North and going to the South and ending up at Field, Mississippi, where we were absolutely segregated on base and whatnot. And that was a different life. But the thing is, we adapted to it and learned to fly. And we did the best we could. And apparently that was pretty good for most of the guys, you know.
You know, it's interesting that you talked about adaptation. And I think that's the essence of the Tuskegee Airmen, that you all were able to adapt to many different experiences. But what I want to ask is this: how did you keep the vigor and the enthusiasm about fighting for this country when you were being treated subpar to your white counterparts? How did you do that? I want to start with you, Colonel Hardy, and then go to you, Colonel Stewart.
Well, the thing is, I went to school, elementary school, 6th grade through the 6th grade, all Afro-American in school, and we went to American history as our history. We consider ourselves part of this country. And when it came down to this thing of, yes, there are racial problems, but this is my country too, you know, and you're ready to fight for it, you know. And we were just as patriotic as anyone else. Although we had problems and whatnot, that was part of the country, but it's still the only country we knew, the only country I knew. And so it was my country and I'm ready to fight for it.
Wow. You, Colonel Stewart, what was your thoughts?
I just might want to add one thing.
Go ahead, Colonel Hardy.
When you look at the world around, there are racial problems in so many countries around the world. And like in India, look at the divisions of the people over there and look at other places, the way people are treated, whatnot. So it's not just our country that has these racial problems. It seems like it's all over the world. Wherever there's some differences in some group, some other group doesn't like them. Right. And that's the way life seems to be in this world.
It's interesting, Colonel Stewart, we were fighting racism in this country and fascism overseas. It was some ism that we were always fighting. How did you keep your enthusiasm? You heard what Colonel Hardy said. He says that this was his country and that's what he was fighting for. Maybe an ideal, maybe not necessarily how he was treated, but the ideal of this country and being a more perfect union. You all wanted to advance that. That kind of how you thought?
Yes, yes. And I was steeped in the Constitution of the United States, and that's where I put my faith in, the Constitution of the United States. And I was steeped in patriotism as a result of that. The prejudice that I had to face at the time there, I did not believe that was part of the country that I believed in. The country that I believed in was that was in the preamble of the Constitution of the United States of America. When I got into the service and the prejudice that I had to face, I kept my eye on the prize, and the prize being to get my wings, to learn how to fly. And I was able to counter any of the pain that I might have suffered as a result of institutional segregation at the time there. But I kept my eye on the prize there, and my faith has always been, as it is still today, in the Constitution of the United States of America.
If you look behind me, you'll see this plane, right? I'm sure that this plane may be a little bit familiar to you guys. Can you tell me a little bit about this plane?
Go ahead, George.
About that plane? Well, that's the P-51. It turned out to be, I guess, the top fighter in World War II, and we were fortunate enough to fly it overseas. The interesting part about that plane is we built that plane for the English. They wanted a plane to support their ground troops, and it was built by North American with an Allison engine in it, and which limited its capability above about 15,000 feet. And the British took it to England and they put the Merlin Rolls-Royce engine into it. And when they did that, it changed the whole characteristic of the airplane. It became the best airplane at any altitude in World War II. So that's the P-51 the British put the engine in it that made it what it is. And after they put the Rolls-Royce engine in it, we built over 14,000 for ourselves, with Packard Motor Company building the engine under license from Rolls-Royce. So it's quite an airplane. And it says combination of British and American knowledge, equipment went into making what it is.
Colonel Stewart, what's your thoughts and memory of this plane?
Well, you might notice one of the things that strikes you at first is the coloration of the aircraft. And you'll notice that the tail section is painted practically all red there. We were known as the Red Tails, and that was our distinctive markings in the 15th Air Force as the 332nd Fighter Group. That was not a pejorative thing as the coloring of the tail was concerned there. It was strictly for identification, and every group that was over there, the white groups also, had distinctive markings on their tail. Only ours was red there. You might be interested, you'll see a yellow strip on that tail in the back there. Yes, just over your right shoulder. Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that stands for the coloring of one of the squadrons that we had. And that was the 302nd Fighter Squadron that had the yellow strip back there. The other three squadrons that were over there with us, they had other distinctive colors. They had blue, black, and white as far as the trim tab is concerned, or where that yellowy color is for the 332nd there.
Oh, wow. You know,
Incidentally,
go ahead, Colonel Hart.
according to the 15th Air Force, they assigned the colors on red, and we could have gotten by painting just the redder red. But they had enough paint, so they painted the whole damn tail red. And it was much easier to see from a long distance. So.
Well, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the rigor of being a Tuskegee Airman. You know, it was not easy because there were a lot of people washed out. Not everybody got a chance to stay in and even go overseas and fly. What was it like in Tuskegee and the grueling schedule that you had to obviously go through to become a pilot with the Tuskegee Airmen?
Well, it was grueling, and it was a 24/7. We were going practically 24 hours a day and practically 7 days a week during war there. But of course, the timing, even in your sleep, there was a certain amount of regimentation. We had to get up at a certain time. We had to go to bed at a certain time. And of course, at times we were doing night flying. We were flying at midnight, learning how to fly in the complete darkness and that type of thing. But the one of the things that we had that we were very happy as far as the Tuskegee Airmen was concerned, we had the campus of Tuskegee University, which was Tuskegee Institute at the time there, just a few miles away from us, something like 7 or 9 miles away from us. And it was absolutely wonderful to go ahead and sort of relax ourselves by being able to be courted and treated so well by the people of the Tuskegee Institute or Tuskegee University.
Wow. What I want to do, gentlemen, is I want to pause and let's look at a short documentary that highlights the triumph and many of the challenges of the Tuskegee Airmen as we talk about the Tuskegee Airmen as they fought at home and fought abroad.
As I looked down, it was like a storm. All those bullets were coming after me.
I felt the two thumps, and the cockpit started filling with smoke, and the airplane, it actually broke in two. And I figured it was time for me to pull the ripcord.
Fire came up out of the floor, right in front of the stick. And I remember the tail going by. I could see the rivets.
I I pulled up in the blind spot, put the sight on him, and just follow it, boom.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, sweeping the United States into war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
By mid-1942, Japan had conquered most of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Nazi Germany had overrun most of Europe. Hitler invaded Russia, hammered Britain, and pushed into North Africa. His regime began the systematic slaughter of millions of people, attempting to create a master race. But America wrestled with its own principles. Despite the statement in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, the United States had long permitted human beings to own other human beings. Slavery had been abolished for 75 years, but even in the 1940s, racial violence against African Americans was still a brutal fact of life.
Segregation was prevalent throughout, and especially in the South. We knew our place. We knew that we had to abide by the laws.
Despite pioneering African-American pilots like Bessie Coleman and Eugene Bullard, in 1940, the number of African-American aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces was still 0.
The Air Corps was not accepting any type of application. Their attitude was that the Negro had neither the physiological or psychological capabilities to operate complicated equipment like an airplane.
But 1940 was an election year. To keep the African-American vote, President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised that African-American soldiers would be trained as military pilots.
Almost every American could come to Tuskegee and see what's been done.
On July 19, 1941, 13 young men reported for training in Tuskegee, Alabama. Their goal? To become the first African-American pilots in the United States Armed Forces. Fighter pilots. Tuskegee had been a logical place to train the pilots. It was a secluded location with good weather year-round. Tuskegee Institute's civilian pilot training program had some of the highest scores in the nation. But the surrounding area was racially hostile.
The Ku Klux Klan was very powerful in the Tuskegee area, and the sheriff was a very, very bigoted individual who worked very hard to arrest the blacks for any infraction whatsoever.
If anything happened, you were always wrong, and there was no place to turn, so you had to be pretty careful where you went, and how you acted.
To be told you can't go here, you can't live there, you can't go into the Five and Dime and get a Coke, it was hard for me.
It was a shock to realize how deep it went. You look in the faces of some of those Southern whites, in your eyes, just to see the hatred that some of them had for us.
In Tuskegee, 2 airfields were hurried to completion. Moton Field for primary flight training, and Tuskegee Army Airfield for basic and advanced flight training. The new airfields were almost entirely African American, but the base officers were almost all white. Frederick von Kimball, commanding officer at Tuskegee Army Airfield, wrote, "Negroes do not have the necessary temperament for leadership to fit them for superior positions." On March 7, 1942, the first class completed their basic and advanced pilot training, becoming the first African-American pilots in the U.S. military. But only 5 of 13 advanced. In December 1942, Tuskegee Army Airfield got a new commanding officer.
We were fortunate enough to have a white colonel named Neal who was open-minded and was willing to make the program that he was put in charge of work.
Colonel Parrish, he was somewhat of an enlightened Kentuckian who was familiar with the race situation and understood it. So he's more sensitive, and he treated everyone basically as individuals.
All of them? Yup. Colonel's orders. Well, what do you know? Things sure are changing around here. Well, it's about time if you're asking me. Right.
Gentlemen, I know the town of Tuskegee is not one where you can feel particularly welcome, but I hope to at least make conditions better on base.
I've had them tell me how they feel about Noel, and I'm almost in tears. One of the fellows said, "There are 2 men in my life who have made my life what it is and directed me in the right area. One was my father. The other was Noel Parrish."
And don't be surprised if I go up for a check ride with you.
In the spring of 1943, the first group of African-American pilots, the 99th Fighter Squadron, deployed to North Africa. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The son of an Army general, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. had been the only African-American in his class at West Point.
And they put on him what they call a silent treatment. We'll talk to you in a classroom setting, but the moment you walked out of that door, nobody would speak to you.
What he suffered there, and I experienced it there, the kind of discipline that he had, this guy was like iron.
Benjamin O. Davis, the commander of the 99th and later the 332nd, he was a man of high standards and yet very human in being able to understand the human weaknesses.
When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, the 99th provided critical air support, earning a Distinguished Unit citation. But another enemy was gathering forces against the Tuskegee Airmen. A white colonel named William Spike Momeyer claimed that the 99th Fighter Squadron showed a lack of aggressive spirit.
90 days after they got into combat, after the 99th got into combat, he recommended that it be taken out of combat. Spike Momeyer's recommendation was ratified all the way up the chain of command to the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold.
High Command was recommending that no more African-American pilots be sent overseas.
Double Victory was a campaign to defeat the Germans and Japanese in World War II. And if we were successful in doing that, it would also be that we would defeat prejudice in the United States.
To win a double victory, the airmen first had to win the right to fight. Their defense fell to their commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. In Washington, Colonel Davis pointed out that the squadron met enemy fighters on 80% of their missions, and that his men often flew 3 to 6 missions a day.
Our squadron is comprised of 26 pilots versus your typical 30 to 35 pilots per squadron.
Benjamin Davis, Jr. got a chance to testify before that board. And every fact that Momeyer put up to take the unit out of combat, he refuted.
And if I may add very frankly, if all the effort invested in the 99th Squadron has produced only a mediocre outfit, then there's no hope. But the 99th is not mediocre.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Davis. That was very succinct, and I appreciate your candor.
The matter was dropped. The Tuskegee Airmen would be in the war for the duration. In January 1944, a massive German strike force hit the Allied position at Anzio. The 99th Fighter Squadron raced to the defense. Clarence Jameson led a formation of 16 fighters.
The controller called me on the radio. Foxtrot leader, we had 22 bogies at 20,000 feet. I maneuvered around down his tail, but my gun jammed and stopped firing. But the rest of my guys were in perfect position, so we got 7 planes in that one day. And that was the best day we had in combat as a squadron.
In 2 days of vicious fighting over Anzio, the 99th racked up the most aerial victories of any squadron, shooting down 13 enemy aircraft.
No more, no longer could that myth that the black man could not fly and fight. They can do extraordinary things. And this they did there on the beaches of Anzio.
Men of the 99th have a brilliant record. Now they take off to aid ground forces advancing on...
By June 1944, the 99th had been in combat for a full year. They'd flown 500 missions, downed 18 enemy planes, and lost just 4 men of their own in combat. A magnificent showing, said the head of the Mediterranean Allied Air Force. That July, the 3 new African-American fighter squadrons joined the 99th in Italy and were gathered into a single unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. The commander for the group was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The combat was often fierce. There was glory, and there was loss.
We came down on this airport, and my good friend, Jimmy Calhoun, was flying with us, and he was so anxious to get an angle to shoot the plane on the ground, he flew into the ground. That was the first major loss that I experienced.
First got killed in Sicily early on. The engine quit on him, and he crash landed, so I knew him pretty well. And I felt pretty bad about it because I felt I should be there to protect him.
My brother lost his life on his 3rd mission over Austria. And we really didn't get any closure on that because we really don't know what happened to him.
The flyers of the 332nd Fighter Group were based at Bramatelli Airfield in Italy. And they were not alone. For every Tuskegee Airman in the air, there were 10 maintenance personnel on the ground supporting him.
We had to have those planes ready to go on the mission in the morning with the guns or bombs if they were canned bombs, fueled up to the hilt so they could fly for 3-4 hours. We guaranteed that.
By the summer of 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen were flying a brand new fighter plane.
We got P-51 Mustangs. Ask an old fighter pilot, what's your favorite aircraft? It's going to be the P-51 Mustang.
Well, the P-51 was one of the most honest aircraft that we flew. It was a stable airplane at most speeds.
The Tuskegee Airmen quickly made their P-51s distinctive.
It was discovered that we had a lot of red paint. So they decided to paint the 332nd Fighter Group's aircraft with red tails.
We agreed when we started getting the D model with the dorsal, paint that tail red. We would paint them, and not only that, but we would take the name, the Red Tails.
The Red Tails under Colonel Davis were a disciplined group.
You got up at 5 o'clock, went in for the briefing. After your briefing, standing at the door was B.O. Davis. Tall, ramrod, looking you dead in the eye as you went out with your chute on your back. Gentlemen, stay with the bombers.
He said unquestionably, our mission is to protect the bombers, not to see how many interceptors we can shoot down. And we are to do whatever is necessary to see that those bombers get safely to their target and back home. And if it meant your sacrifice of your life, that's what you're there for.
Because here you are over Germany, and flight engineer hit me on the shoulder. And he went like that. And I looked out the window, and there was a P-51, and he was flying extremely close. He was wearing an oxygen mask, which covered almost all of the face. But I could tell that under that oxygen mask, the face was black. And I knew right away that this Mustang was being flown by the all-Negro 332nd Fighter Group. And I looked back at his tail, and sure enough, the tail was painted red. And I signaled to him that we were okay. It was extremely comforting to know what they were doing. They were telling me, they came down to see if I was okay. And they were telling me, we're here. Well, after a few minutes, they left. They went back up to altitude. But some of them were assigned to us to watch us as we went back. Up until that time, I had never spoken to a black more than a few words. That was the beginning of a relationship where I understood that they weren't that much different. You know, they were not those people.
I wanted to thank you for helping us up there.
We were all doing the same thing. Those guys were flying fighter airplanes. They were risking their lives to protect our lives.
Take after the bombers. Stay with the bombers. That's good to know you got our back.
But even as the fighters did well in combat over Europe, African-American crews ran into problems back home. James Warren was a navigator bombardier in the 477th Bombardment Group.
Finally, they moved the group up to Freeman Field, Indiana. But when we got up there, we were confronted again with a very discriminatory and segregated position by the command.
By 1944, the War Department prohibited segregation of military facilities. But Group Commander Colonel Robert Selway created 2 officers' clubs at Freeman Field. One for African-American trainees and one for whites. On April 5th, 1945, an organized group of African-American officers deliberately attempted to enter the Forbidden Club.
You can't come in.
Why?
You belong to the trainees, and the trainees can't come in.
I am a member of the base squadron.
Well, niggers can't come in.
One of their leaders, Roger Terry, shouldered aside an officer who blocked his way.
There were 61 officers who were put under arrest for entering or attempting to enter the officers' club.
They arrested the first group under a letter order, and they arrested 61 of us in 2 days. I was in the first group that was arrested.
Selway soon released most of the officers, but he prepared a statement spelling out which personnel could use which club and ordered everyone at Freeman Field to sign it.
Base Regulation 85-2 identifies the assignments of facilities for all base personnel.
To me, it said, I agree to be segregated and discriminated against. No way was I going to sign this.
There was 101 who refused the order to segregate yourself. I'm one of those 101.
To refuse that direct order of a commanding officer in time of war was a violation of Article of War 64. Maximum punishment was death.
This is a direct order. Sign the regulation.
The The arrests at Freeman Field triggered a strong public reaction. Congressmen and senators complained to the War Department. For nearly 2 weeks, the 101 officers were held under arrest. It was like a Nazi prison camp, one man said. Finally, the case reached the top. General George Marshall ordered Selway to release all but 3 of the men. Roger Terry, the only man convicted, suffered a fine, loss of rank, and a dishonorable discharge. As for Selway, he was relieved of his command because he violated Army regulation. The war ended before the 477th Bombardment Group could see action. But at Freeman Field, these airmen too had scored a crucial triumph at home.
Double victories for the Freeman Field mutiny. That's it. So that's what that's about. Victory at home, victory abroad. And Freeman Field is the victory at home.
In May 1945, Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. In 3 years, Tuskegee had trained almost 1,000 pilots and some 15,000 support personnel. They'd flown 1,500 missions overseas. 84 Tuskegee Airmen lost their lives during the war, but they'd created an astounding record of success. In October 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group came home at last to the nation they'd risked their lives for.
We got no ticker tape parade. We got no welcome. You got off the boat and you went and got on a segregated train and you rode it home for your 30 days leave.
When the war ended, with all the experience that we had, pilots and mechanics, we thought that we'd just go downtown and sign up with the airlines. They told me, you know, you fit the bill, but we're not hiring any colored mechanics.
Coming back home, you talking about feeling downhearted? You're darn right. But this was what was going on in the United States of America in 1945. Lynching, all kinds of segregation.
Due in part to the exemplary performance of the Tuskegee Airmen, on July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the armed forces. In the country at large, segregation was still the law of the land. But the Tuskegee Airmen had given their people something more than hope.
My experience as a Tuskegee Airman gave me inner strength to get out and join Martin Luther King and walk 53 miles for freedom. Tuskegee Airmen came home and became involved in the struggle at home. And as a result, they changed the condition at home.
The Tuskegee Airmen were men with goals, determination, and the desire to overcome the odds of life, to succeed and be recognized as citizens. Not so much for the glory that it might bring for themselves, but it was the love of this country, in spite of her imperfections.
Dreams come true. The dream to end segregation, the dream to be an aviator, the dream to be a college professor, the dream to be a leader in the community. Those are great things to happen. But the other part of it is the challenge that remains.
Take advantage of that opportunity. You don't pass it up. That's what the Tuskegee Airmen did. When that door opened, they walked through it with their qualifications and their ability to perform. you don't have to pay your dues, nothing at all. Be easy, you don't have to work at it, but you have the opportunity, and the sky is the limit.
Well, let me tell you, the more I see what you all did, and the more I just visually see the kinds of triumph and the kinds of true heroism that you all displayed, I am in perpetual awe of you both and all of the Tuskegee Airmen. I want, let me tell you what I want personally. I want everybody in the world to know about the Tuskegee Airmen. I want everybody to know not just what you went through and not just what you accomplished, but what you had to fight for the right to fight. And that's something that I think people need to know, that you didn't just, it wasn't something given to you, and that you earned the respect of the white pilots as well. I want to talk about earning respect. Respect is not given. Respect must be earned. Colonel Hardy, tell me about the earning of respect and how that came about.
Well, you earn respect by doing your job and to the best of your ability and whatnot. Now, going through Tuskegee, we had a lot of things to overcome, but that caused us to turn inward. And our classmates, our roommates, they became so important to each of us. We just had to talk about a family affair, brotherly association with those guys. We had to depend on each other. And that's the way we survived, you know. Like I say, lifelong friends that we made in those days, whatnot. And and actually, I had a full military career where racial integration took place, and we had to then compete with others. And we did a damn good job, I thought, in so many cases. You know, one of our members, Chappie James, became a 4-star general, you know. And then when I look at the things today where the chief of staff of the Air Force is General Brown, Afro-American. And in fact, the Department of Defense run by General Austin, Afro-American. We've come a long way from those days, years ago, when I could say the War Department report in 25 said you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. And now look at what has happened as far as this country is concerned. We led the way, and the people behind us have proven that they can still lead and do a good job. So you look at that and you figure, well, you're just thankful that you were part of the whole damn thing, you know.
Colonel Stewart, do you ever stop and think about the fact that you all probably were the catalyst for the integration of the military? Have you thought about that and what that means? You know, Colonel Hardy just talked about how the high-level African Americans now, who obviously had to have some foundation for getting to those places. You don't just, they were a continuation. In fact, they're probably the personification of the struggle of the Tuskegee Airmen. Have you ever thought about what you all did to make positions like this available for other Black people?
Well, not only the people like General James that Colonel Hardy mentioned, and even looking at the Secretary of Defense that we have today, but the fact that all of the airlines that we have today, all of them, every one of them, have Black personnel in the cockpit there that are flying those planes around the world and flying the best of our commercial aircraft around the world. They all say that the Tuskegee Airmen was the root behind the placement and the eventuality of these people becoming aircrew members on the nation's commercial aircraft besides the military aircraft.
Wow.
I just might add one thing is, when you go back to say World War II and before World War II, but in the service, they would never have an Afro-American over a white person. That was the way things were in the service then, structured that way. So a white person would never be supervised by a black person. And that was the way things were in those days. And that's just the way life was. But you can see how that has changed over the years.
You know, it's interesting. The Booker T. Washington said, for those things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers on the hand. But for mutual progress, we can be as close as a fist. I guess, you know, for those of you who made friends, who were part of the elite groups and were officers and couldn't go into officers' clubs to have socialization with your newfound white friends, how does that make you feel?
Well, I certainly didn't like it, and it was a terrible thing at the time to be fighting wars on two fronts there. One is the enemy on the in Europe there, and then the enemy back here in the United States being the racial prejudice that we had. But as Colonel Hardy said, we overcame that, and as people overextending themselves in order to prove themselves, I think of Colonel Hardy there, who happens to be one of the very, very few airmen who flew a combat in all three wars. And he flew combat in not only World War II, but flew combat in Korea and then flew combat in Vietnam. It's quite a thing.
You know, I often wonder about how heroes get ticker tape parades and when they come back home. I assume that you all didn't get a ticker tape parade. In fact, many of you were treated when you returned home worse than people who we were fighting against. And so I guess I want to ask the question, you know, what do you do about it, if anything? And what do you believe we can do from now? Because if you look at racism, it hasn't gone anywhere. We can look at January the 6th and see an insurrection in our nation's capital, the citadel of democracy. And we recognize that racism hadn't gone anywhere. And so I want to ask the question is, what can we do now? I mean, you all are up in age and you all have great wisdom because you've seen so much. And so I want to ask the question more in a contemporary way. What can we do about this notion of racism? And I'll let each of you kind of share.
Well, I will just say, we put up with a lot. We went overseas, we came back, and we were subject to the same racial problems as was when we went over. And it lasted for so many years. But it started to take its, it started to make an effect, had an effect when I went back into the service in 48. I got out of the service in 46, went back in 48, and I was going to NYU. I had to finish that semester before I went back in, and I was going to the segregated unit at Lockburn. But in April of that year, the Air Force was 7 months old, the United States Air Force. It was removed from the Army, United States Army Air Forces was pulled from the Army and became the United States Air Force. And what that did was the people in the United States Army Air Forces, they moved upward and a number of the generals became in higher positions in the United States Air Force. And one of the high generals in the Air Force personnel, a few months after the Air Force became a separate service, started a study on racial integration. And 7 months after the Air Force was formed, in April 1948, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Carl Spaatz, announced that the Air Force was going to integrate racially in April of 48. And 3 months later, President Truman signed the executive order directing Army, Navy, and Air Force to integrate. And that's the way it started, the way I see it. So apparently, the people in the Air Force, a lot of them knew about what happened in the 12th Air Force in Europe and the 15th Air Force in Europe. And it had an effect on what the Air Force decision was in 1948 when they said they're going to integrate. And then President Truman took up the cudgel and issued Executive Order 9981, which started racial integration in the service. And so in 1949, the Air Force's plan was approved, and the Air Force was all ready to, people at Lockburn was suddenly shifted to transfer to Air Force bases all over the world. And suddenly we lost track of each other because it happened so fast. And that's the way it started in 49, racial integration. So we think we had a greater effect on it.
I want to take us back because, you know, we talk about the Tuskegee Airmen as, and many people look at it as exclusively pilots, but there were other people who were part of the Tuskegee Airmen that made it possible for you guys to be successful. There were flight instructors and mechanics and cooks and janitors and doctors and nurses and other people who were also a part of the Tuskegee Airmen. Mm-hmm. And I think oftentimes, and even women, in fact, in 1942, due to the wartime manpower shortage, the Army Air Force began accepting women as apprentice mechanics during that time. And so we have to make sure that we tell the whole story about the Tuskegee Airmen. Agree, gentlemen?
The ultimate aim was to train fighter pilots to go overseas and represent, not represent, but protect the bombers that we were flying over at the time. However, we could not have done that job, and I'm talking about the pilots, the combat pilots who were in combat, without those people who were the staff and the training people for the pilots that did go overseas there. For every pilot that was trained in the Air Force or Air Corps, we had to have anywhere from 10 to 15 people to go ahead and support them. Those planes could not fly, the pilots would not be able to fly, the pilots would not be able to do anything without the help of those people on the ground there. So they were just as much, as you say, the fists there that made the whole hand come together as far as the Tuskegee Airmen were concerned.
Colonel,
if I'd add one thing there is when you talk about the formation of the Tuskegee Airmen, the maintenance people were a big part of that because the first group, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was formed at Chanute Field in Illinois. And 270 some Afro-American young men were assigned to it. They had a white commander, but they were assigned to it. And their job was to learn all phases of maintenance, aircraft maintenance at Chanute. It was a training base, all phases of maintenance. Now that was in the early, about February or March of 1941. The first class of pilots didn't form at Tuskegee until July of 41. So you see how important maintenance is, getting those people out there to learn how to maintain airplanes first. And then the pilots started training in at Tuskegee Institute in July of 41. And that first class graduated in March of 42. Well, the 99th Fighter Squadron had been in existence for almost a year before the first pilots were assigned. But the maintenance people had been working, maintaining airplanes, doing that whole year. So you see how important maintenance is, more important really than the pilots. You've got to have good airplanes that reliable airplanes. And that's the way it was. So you talk about a support people. A pilot must depend on good support people.
You know, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Chief Charles Anderson, right? I mean,
Chief Anderson.
Yes.
Tell me about him, please.
Well, I didn't get to fly with him, but certainly I saw him on any number of occasions there. And he was actually head of the primary group that was the first group to start flying there. There were three phases of the three flying phases that you go through. And that very first phase that we had there is Chief Anderson was head of that, the instructor pilots who trained us in that first phase. And he was a fine gentleman. I just regret that I never got to fly with him myself, but he was our, I don't know how to say it. It brings tears to my eyes, but anyway.
Yeah.
He was on a pedestal, really.
Yes.
He learned to fly during the early years. He put so much effort in learning to fly, and he had quite a bit of recognition, you know. And he was at Tuskegee. Is one of the reasons why Tuskegee program succeeded as well as it did. Chief Anderson was a chief instructor there because all the instructors there were Afro-Americans who came from other universities, whatnot, around the country. And he put them together and made sure they taught the students properly. So,
yeah.
You know, a lot of times people don't understand it was Chief Anderson that took First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt up to fly with him.
That's right.
And as a result of that, she came back and told her husband, the president then, that these people can fly. And if I can put my life in their hands, certainly give them a chance. And that, I think, was the invitation.
But boy, let's back off a minute. I've seen some people say that she was the catalyst for it, which isn't true.
Okay.
The people were already at Chanute Field when she flew with Chief Anderson. The people already at Chanute in the 99th Pursuit Squadron. And she flew with Chief Anderson about a month or so after that. So the thing had already started as far as the maintenance people are concerned.
Okay.
No.
That's wonderful.
She was a real advocate. That's what I would say.
That's right, she was.
Great
Well, you know why she was at Tuskegee? She didn't go down and fly with him. She was part of the
board of directors.
Ram Sears. He was supporting Tuskegee with money and whatnot, and she was part of the group. You might say the members of the board, and they had a meeting at Tuskegee, and that's the reason she was down. The Rosenwald Fund, and she was down there as part of that board. He supplied a lot of money. In fact, his group, the Rosenwald group, built over 5,000 schools in the South for Afro-Americans over the years. And he also supplied a lot of money in the 20s and 30s for people like Marion Anderson to go to Europe and learn, things like that. Rosenwald did a lot as far as Afro-Americans were concerned. And she was down there as part of the board and they had a meeting at Tuskegee. Of course, they had given Tuskegee money for various things. And since she was there, she flew with Chief Anderson.
You know, the last statement that I want to make, you know, we're in the middle of COVID-19, and that's why we are having this virtually. Normally, we would have an in-person banquet and activities for 2, 3, 4 days. And so we had to not do that this time, right? Defer until hopefully next year. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that Tuskegee is known primarily for two things. Obviously, George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, that's notwithstanding, that is one of the cornerstones for our history and what we're known for. But we also have the infamous United States Public Health Service study done in Tuskegee. Did you all know about that? And I guess in 1972 when it was revealed, was that the first time that you all were made aware of while you were here at Tuskegee, doing the work that you were doing, that many of the residents of Tuskegee was a part of just an egregious experiment?
No, I did not learn about that until after I had gotten out of the service. And this was probably sometime, as you say, in the 70s that I learned about that. But it was an infamous, as you say, thing that occurred as far as it's concerned. And it was people usurping their power or power to go ahead and put a onus or ill-advised treatment or non-treatment on people who had no say in the matter or anything like that, as far as that was concerned. It was an experimentation, and it was an experimentation upon these veterans that were in the Veterans Hospital at that time there, just like the Tuskegee Airmen was an experimentation as far as the flying was concerned there. But I consider that with the veterans even more onerous than the Tuskegee Airmen was concerned there. It was taking people's bodies and actually using them for some ill-gotten belief as far as medical treatment was concerned. And it gets me angry just to think about it today. I can understand the feeling that people might have today as far as authoritarian quests are made, even with this virus as it's going on here, as to, is this an experimentation or is this a repeat of what happened down at the Tuskegee Veterans Hospital? And it's something to think about.
Right.
That's it. I didn't remember anything about it, but it was at the VA hospital there where that took place, apparently. And we never had an association with the VA hospital, as far as I know.
Yeah. It was all over the county, so it's not just relegated to the hospital. It was all over the county, but these were people who were, unbeknownst to them, guinea pigs. And as you so aptly said, Colonel Stewart, that they didn't know that they were in a study, nor did they know that treatment after penicillin was made available, they didn't know that they were denied treatment as well. And many of them did not find out until after it was revealed in 1972. So we have in Tuskegee such a high in terms of the Tuskegee Airmen and all of the wonderful things you did. And then we had the low of the Tuskegee Syphilis study. And so we had the highs and the lows. And I know that is that's the whole of Tuskegee. So we are resilient because we're still here. And that's the wonderful thing. Well, one of the things I want to do is I want to bring on a person, because it's important that we keep the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen alive. And the only way we can do that is that we have people who support the Friends of the Tuskegee Airmen Historic Site. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring on Bryan Williams of Brighton Entertainment and have him make the appeal. And we'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Bryan Williams, executive producer of the In Their Own Words, the Tuskegee Airmen. Let us dedicate ourselves to ensuring that the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen lasts for generations to come, forever. The Airmen's dedication and passion prove that courage, valor, purpose, commitment to service, and intelligence are not defined by the color of a man's skin, but by perseverance, dedication, purpose, and the determination to succeed. Please donate today and help us keep their legacy alive.
Thanks, Bryan. Thank you so much for that wonderful appeal. I want to end by saying thank you. If I could have 1,000 tongues, I couldn't thank you enough. for what you all have done. You all have meant so much to me personally and to not only African Americans, but people around the world. Again, I believe that everyone in the world should know about the Tuskegee Airmen and know the great work that you've done, not only to fight overseas. There was a victory at home. You had to fight at home and then fight overseas. And so we want to thank you for the fight. Thank you for your commitment to looking beyond faults and finding needs for this country. Thank you for your commitment to the Constitution, the ideal of America, and keeping that as your focus. I'd like to thank all of the people who have been a part of this program. There have been so many people. I couldn't go any further than to thank the chairman of the board, Chairman Colonel Palmer Sullins, and the entire board. I certainly couldn't go one step further than to really give a hearty thank you to the executive director, Dr. Gwendolyn Treywick Moore, and her team, all of the people who made this possible. And we're going to continue this each year. On March the 7th, we're going to have some kind of documentary that continues to put out the wonderful story of the Tuskegee Airmen. I'll leave you with this word. I was told that there are 3 ways that you can die. One is the death. The other one is the interment. And the last one is when people forgot you ever lived. Now, we can't do anything about the first death. We all will die. None of us will get out of this alive. And there will be an interment, whether or not cremation or burial. But I promise you this, that third death will never take place, for we will always remember the life and the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. Thank you so much for joining with us as we celebrate today the Tuskegee Airmen in the state of Alabama. I'm Omar Neal, as we bid you farewell.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello again. I'm Bryan Williams, executive producer of In Their Own Words, the Tuskegee Airmen. Your financial support is critically needed in assisting the Friends of Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. Their mission? To assist the National Park Service with their directive to commemorate, preserve, and protect the Tuskegee Airmen Historic Site. Thank you very much for your support, and God bless.